We are on the frontiers of a new science. We're all starting to awaken to truths about who we are and where we're going. Open yourself to new knowledge about the power of spiritual energy and consciousness. Journey with Donna Smith-Moncrieffe as she takes you through the world of mediumship, energy healing, out-of-body experiences, past life regression, and all topics that demonstrate evidence of the true nature of our reality.
Welcome to On the Frontiers of a New Science. I am Donna Smith-Moncrieffe, and on today's show we will have a discussion that relates scientific facts with the survival of consciousness. Very few of us have had the opportunity to sit with an authentic physical medium and experience the materialization of someone who once resided on the physical plane. Given this limited experience, it is important for the population to hear how past scientists have provided us with key facts that explain the true nature of our existence. Today we have Professor Peter Wadhams to guide us through this discussion. He is the Professor of Ocean Physics at the University of Cambridge. Professor Wadhams is renowned for his 40 years of work examining how changes in the Arctic and Antarctic are impacting the world climate. So you are thinking, how does a leading scientist studying climate change become interested in metaphysics issues? Well, with no further ado, let's find out from the professor himself. Welcome, Peter, to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Very, very well, thank you.
Wonderful to have you here. I'm very excited about doing this show with you today, and I thought we could start off by finding out, how does a leading scientist in the area of the Arctic and climate change become interested in survival of consciousness issues?
Well, I think it was the other way around, really. I was interested in parapsychology and psychical research questions before I became a practicing geophysicist. And really, as a child, I would read everything there was to read, and got. I think I can probably date it back to the age of 12. But
wow.
I won a school prize, and I could choose whatever book I wanted. And at that stage, I was reading a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, at that stage, it was Sherlock Holmes stories. But there was another series of stories that he wrote called the Professor Challenger stories, which were dramatic stories. And even at that stage, I wanted to be a scientist, so I thought I could model myself on Professor Challenger, who would fearlessly study any problem and solve it. So I got this prize of the best-known Professor Challenger story. In fact, the only one that's really remembered very much is The Lost World, which was the inspiration for Jurassic Park. But when I got the book, the longest story in it was called The Land of Mist. And this wasn't really a novel, although it was written as such, but it was Arthur Conan Doyle, who was very interested in paranormal and spiritualism, expressing what he knew or thought about survival of death, and he cast it in the form of a novel where this problem was being investigated by Professor Challenger. But everything in the book was real. It was, and he had annotations to these were cases which had been studied, and so that got me very interested in this question. And then, so I kept reading everything that was around on it. And then when I went to Cambridge as a student, the university had a local Society for Psychical Research, as well as the national one, of course, it's the Cambridge University Society, run by a very, very enthusiastic person called Tony Cornell, who died recently. And he really spent his whole life investigating spontaneous cases, and in a very, very determined manner, and exposed a lot of hoaxes and frauds, but was very, very serious. And he ran this Cambridge Society, so I became the research officer for it and started doing some research projects of my own with student colleagues. and including one on psychokinesis, where we were trying to make a beam of electrons move so that we got a different rate of scoring when you were thinking at it compared to when you weren't thinking at it. This ended up being a kind of predecessor to the work that was done over a long period later by the Princeton group of Bob Jahn.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
So I really got introduced to the subject at an early age, and Cambridge University then in the 60s did have a lot of senior people in it who were very interested in psychical research and were pursuing that as in addition to their official jobs. That was tolerated, and I think it was a throwback to the fact that the people who founded the Society for Psychical Research in 1882 were largely Cambridge scientists, or a lot of them were Cambridge scientists. So there was a tradition of psychical research in Cambridge that was still existing in the 1960s, and I was able to benefit from that.
So can I ask you then, Peter, so if you had a choice, it sounded like the scientists, as you said, that it was tolerated for them to study this as long as it was alongside traditional science. So would it be, if we go back there then, would it be that scientists knew or budding scientists knew that if they pursued it, perhaps it wouldn't be recognized research, it wouldn't be potentially funded, probably wouldn't have a very flourishing career? Did these kind of things curb your inability, for example, to make that mainstream work?
Yes, I think it did. I found at that time, this was when I was a student, that psychical research was, I thought, the most interesting and the most important field of science that there is, because it's pushing at the ultimate boundaries about the nature of man and the nature of consciousness. And that must be surely the most important field of science that one could imagine. And so naively at that stage I assumed, well, this is something one can do as one's scientific career. But then I fairly quickly learned that there is no scientific career to be had in psychical research. There's no career structure, there's no posts in it. If you're going to do it, you have to do it in your spare time while you're doing some other kind of science as your official job. And I found that was very disappointing, and it made me feel there's something wrong with science, and which I still feel. But in terms of toleration, I can name some of the people in Cambridge then that were doing psychical research, but not as their day job. So, for instance, and some that may be irrelevant to yourself was Dr. Owen, who was a physiologist, and he was very active, but ended up going to Toronto to found this new a group called the New Horizons Fellowship, which was carrying on doing psychical research as long as the funding from a philanthropist lasted. And they did this work on conjuring up an imaginary ghost called Philip. So they were able to achieve physical effects in a seance room with an entity that they themselves had created. So that casts a lot of light on that question. That was, and then Donald West was a very, very well-known psychical researcher, but he was professor of criminology in Cambridge. And then finally, the person who was very helpful to me was called C.D. Broad, Charlie Broad, who was a philosopher, and he was mainly distinguished for me by the fact that he lived in Isaac Newton's old rooms at Trinity College. So he showed us around where Newton lived, and he was very famous as a philosopher, but he was also president of the Society for Psychical Research. So he could be a philosopher in his official Cambridge duties, but a psychical researcher as well. So that's how people in Cambridge reconciled the two. And and to some extent they still do. But it's not obviously really the right way to advance the science of parapsychology. You need to have people who are able to do it as their scientific career.
Yeah, no, and I love the way, thank you so much for giving us that sort of that brief overview of first of all, it demonstrates that people who are very interested in parapsychology or metaphysics have a diverse background. You know, you talked about a physiologist, a criminologist, a philosopher, and that's what I found in researching. People are first and foremost other things. They're lawyers, they're doctors, they're philosophers, and then they are able to do this as their primary career. Literally funds the research for the parapsychology information, which I find absolutely interesting. One of the things, and exactly what you're talking about really resonates with me. When I was doing my research last year with David Thompson and observing the materializations over a 10-day period there, I met a professor who he indicated he didn't mind quoting some of his thoughts, but he couldn't use his real name because he had indicated that he works for a very conservative, he's in a tenured position, a tenured professor, works in a very elite university in the United States, and indicated to me that his post would be ripped away from him in a moment if he ever blogged or spoke openly about materialization. And what he had said to me is that he knew that other individuals in his faculty were interested in reading about this. It just couldn't be discussed openly, which again goes back to your point, Peter, about us not being scientists, but not being able to discuss new discoveries. Science is about uncovering, in a rational way, new discoveries.
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, I've found it highly disillusioning as a scientist to find that there are certain areas of science that are taboo, even though they're carried out with exactly the same protocols, exactly the same experimental techniques, exactly the same controls as any other scientific experiment, and yet when they come up with the results, they can't get them published in the mainstream scientific journals, and the authors themselves are liable to suffer in their careers. So it means there's a kind of censorship in science that science is, if we want to advance in science as rapidly as possible, we should be looking into every unknown problem that there is and embrace the unknown. But instead, science is rejecting certain things, saying you can't study that if you value your career, and so those subjects don't advance. And that's anything to do with the mind and consciousness, is anything to do with psychical research or survival. And even, bizarrely, there are some branches of perfectly normal physics that have become taboo, like cold fusion, for instance, which is a technique that doesn't work all the time, but lots of evidence exists that it does work, and it can work, and it's not anything mystical. It's just some physical process that we don't understand. But even then, the people who were doing the first experiments were absolutely slaughtered and had their careers destroyed because it didn't agree with the current paradigm about how do you achieve a nuclear reaction. So instead of paying attention to the observations and the measurements, there was a sort of prearranged mentality amongst scientists that this is impossible. Therefore, if you seem to be observing something, you must be mistaken. So we're not going to pay any attention. It's a very sad thing. It really is putting a brake on the progress of science.
Now, let's examine that a little further, because it's really intriguing what you're talking about, and the case of cold fusion is a perfect example. Is it the fear of having the status quo overturned? Like, for example, let's say you've got people who are flourishing from medical books that they've written, or they're benefiting from things that are already agreed upon in science. Is it really just that if something else comes along, it could hurt their reputation? In other words, they're teaching a particular subject, it hurts their reputation. Isn't it possible that if we had a sort of view that science is evolving, which we absolutely know it has, because if we look have a retrospective look back, we can see so many things that we said in the name of science was correct that is absolutely wrong. If all of us took the view that the world is evolving, we may have published something, and now we're going to learn more things, why would people then still hold on to the status quo, so much so that we would hurt the careers of people who are, stating facts, which I think they did very much substantiate the existence of cold fusion? What really is the fear there exactly?
Well, I think in the case of something like cold fusion, it's good old-fashioned kind of greed and desire to maintain one's fame and fortune. And I mean, it's not. There's nothing deeply emotional there. It's typical nasty human greed, because the whole community of hot fusion people, which is tens of thousands of engineers and scientists throughout the world, have very lucrative careers developing fusion reactors that sometime 20 years from today, which is always 20 years from today, will produce commercially viable nuclear power, which will solve the world's problems, because it will be fusion power that doesn't require any raw materials. So it's huge amounts of money are being spent on nuclear fusion research, and of course equally huge or even huger amounts are being spent on particle physics research, like the Large Hadron Collider. And people have their whole careers tied up in that. And if somebody comes along and says, "Oh, I can do this on the top of a bench," and it doesn't cost more than £1,000 to build one of these, they're not going to welcome it. They're going to slaughter him, which is what they've done. So for something like that, it's very easy to see the motive, and it's human. It's a very human thing. But for something like the paranormal, it's something more subtle, because when the Society for Psychical Research was founded, for instance, there were many of the leading scientists of the day were members, like Crookes and Lodge and Curie. I mean, Pierre Curie was a member, and a future Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour. Gladstone was a member. Lord Rayleigh, who was another famous physicist. There was a very, very distinguished list of members of that society when it was founded, and that meant there was the whole establishment of Britain was fully behind the concept that we should investigate and study in a scientific manner the question of whether we survive death and whether the phenomena that people seem to be reporting, like telepathy, are real. And the establishment was behind it. Somehow, things changed over a century, so that now the establishment is absolutely opposed to it. So nobody who does psychical research will ever prosper in their careers. There was no career structure. There were there's one or two positions in psychical research in British universities, but only because of unremitting efforts by the now recently died professor in Edinburgh, Bob Morris. And so it's not a career option, and it's also a career destroyer as well. And that's the opposite of the way psychical research was 100 years ago when it started, and that is a mystery. And I think it's because the conventional science, like psychology, was trying to get itself established as a science, and physics was trying to reduce the number of variables and parameters it was trying to consider, and didn't want the idea that you're doing a physics experiment and some force comes in and maybe changes your results because you're thinking about it. And this is what would happen with psychokinesis. That's very, very unwelcome. You don't want this kind of stuff to be around, and so if you ignore it, it might go away. That's been the attitude that's developed, and it's had very dire results on the progress of psychical research.
Absolutely, and I also think it's that, and it's the larger fact that I think people began to understand the power of individual powers that people had. Telepathy. When I just think of the Helen Duncan case, just that case concretely, when she was able to start sharing war secrets. When people start to think about it like that, it becomes a power issue, right? If somebody can share that kind of information and hurt a whole administration, it starts to be something that they even started, of course, to study more quietly and more covertly in the CIA, for example, where they don't want the world to know that, people were studying, remote viewing. All of these were covert projects. And I'm sure that they still continue to do that and explore new technologies that they have and new understandings and that we have with anti-gravity systems and that kind of thing, which they don't want to share because it's very, very powerful. And we certainly don't want to share to individuals that they have the power through out-of-body experiences, through mediumship, through past life regression, for example, to start unlocking the mysteries of the power. Because, of course, even in the religious institutions, then we have people that realize that, okay, well, in the church, if people don't have to go through us and they know that they have individual powers, then that is also not an ideology that they want to disperse. And, I mean, it really comes down to power dynamics and, as you said good old greed. Now, I want to ask you, just before we go on, Peter, to discussing, for example, some specific historical scientists that have paved the way and demonstrated sort of a scientific foundation for metaphysics and survival of consciousness. I wanted to ask you before, have you had any personal experiences that have let you know what, it's not just the research that you've read, that you know this to be true? Because just before you answer that, I know for myself it was parallel. While I had spiritual experiences even while and before doing my own research that said nobody can tell me that this doesn't exist because I've experienced it for myself. So I wondered if you could share that.
Yes. Sorry. Good question. I have had some experiences, but wouldn't regard myself as a very psychic person. I don't routinely have any, but I think there were two things that stand out. One was just after my mother died. My wife and I went to a medium who lived nearby near Cambridge, and he was a mental medium, and he would come out with a whole. He would seem to be listening to some voice that was talking over his shoulder, and he'd come out with a stream of stuff, which we'd record, of course, and most of it was didn't seem to have any relevance to anything. It was kind of static, but then suddenly he'd come out with something that was absolutely, definitely referred to somebody we knew, and in this case it was my mother. And I found this, I've done a lot of background reading in psychical research, and if you look back at the old proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, and I've got them going all the way back to 1880s, they used to print the entire, if there was a seance, for instance, with Mrs. Piper, who was the sort of star medium of the time, they would print about 100 pages of everything that she said during the seance. And she was renowned for coming up with evidential material from, and it, as always, is still regarded as the best medium ever. But when you look at the transcript of 5% of it is, well, I won't say garbage because it might be real, but it's not anything that anybody can make any sense out of. And then suddenly she'd lock in and something really important would come out. So this medium did the same. He started to say a couple of things to me in the manner that my mother used to speak. And then he said that two things were he wanted, this person wanted to get across to me, and it was a blue scarf and Charlie. And I thought, and we wrote this down, it didn't mean anything at all to us. But at that time, we were clearing out her flat because she just died, and we hadn't finished yet. And about 2 or 3 days after that, we got to dealing with her bedroom, and in her bedside cabinet, there was a blue chiffon scarf and a bottle of Charlie perfume lying on top of it. And we'd never seen that ever. It was very private part of our house. We never were there, and we never knew she had either of these things. And she was guiding us to that and saying, look, here, she was very clever, really, to say, here's some evidence that I'm still alive. And that was very conclusive as far as I was concerned. And then in terms of psychic rather than spiritual, I guess, I've had a few precognitive experiences, and one of them was very powerful, and that was written up as a paper in Paranormal Review, which is one of the journals that the Society for Psychic Research does. Mm-hmm. And that was that I dreamed that I was in a strange place. It was a kind of a glass office building, looking down over a great distance at some very incredibly neat landscape of mixture of houses and fields, and very, very neat. It looked so obsessively neat. I thought during the dream, this must be Switzerland. And then I knew I was in that town for just one day, and I had to do everything that day. And so I was going to explore this town, but as I looked, all the buildings started vanishing under fog, and I couldn't see anything. So I thought, how can I explore this town when there's all this fog around? So It was a very vivid dream. And then 10 days later, my wife and I went to Italy. She'd been called to have an interview for a job there, completely at very short notice. We had no idea that this was going to happen. We'd never been to this town before in Italy, and we were put up for one night in the hotel, and it was a kind of hill town, so the hotel looked down over the surrounding countryside, and the hotel dining room had vertical glass windows, so it looked a bit like an office block. You looked out and you looked down, and there was exactly the landscape that I'd seen in my dream 10 days earlier. It was like nothing. And the interesting thing is, I go to Italy a lot because my wife's Italian. I'd never been to that part of Italy before, and we'd never been to a part of Italy that looked like that with all these neat things around. Normally, things don't look very neat. And then on top of that, just as I was remembering this dream and thought, this is exactly my dream, but where's the fog? And then as I was remembering that, a load of bonfires were being lit by the farmers because it was autumn, and they were burning leaves and crop relics, and that the smoke was spreading across the houses and obscuring them, just as in the dream. So and the thing is that I was keeping a record of my dreams at the time, so I wrote the dream down on my computer just as I had it, and that was attested. And then 10 days later, it happened, and so that was a very, very evidential case of precognition over 10 days, and I can't find any other explanation for it because I wasn't expecting to go to that place. We'd never been there before. We never knew anything about it. It was a complete surprise when we got there and found exactly the scene that I dreamed earlier.
Your two examples are excellent, and just I want to make a comment on both. The latter one, I have many of those, and that was the impetus for me. In fact, with the first study that I had done on mediumship, I had wanted to study more systematically prescient information because I had experienced that through dreaming. And what's interesting about what you said is you know the difference between regular dreams, and you talked about this being a vivid dream. And vivid dreams, usually you can tell the difference. And I think just your very example of that tells scientists there is something more to the nature of our reality. And we should be taking a closer look at this because some of us have this more than others. The other thing I wanted to pick up was on your excellent example of mediumship, which is why when scientists go to study mediumship and try to systematically score, you talked about much of the information that the medium shared at the time was not even important. It didn't even seem relevant. But again, what I had done in my study is I did a follow-up between 2010 and 2012 of 88 sitters, and that's where the real research happens. If you've noticed traditional research with other panels that really haven't been that interested in doing very good research on mediumship, they test and do the score at one time, which doesn't take into consideration that the spirit world is trying to demonstrate that it's actually not coming from the mind of the sitter. It's telling us that, some information you're going to find out later, and that demonstrates that it's not mind reading. And so it's just a call out. Your example is a call out for our listeners that, be careful when you're reading that research where there even those talk shows that they do, and they have the medium just try to give a one-shot a reading with somebody, and if they don't verify anything on the spot, all of a sudden they're a fraud. Well, good research follows up on the information that a medium shares because it's through time that a lot of that information becomes more relevant. So in all that, before we get to talking about Sir William Crookes, it's very important, and I've heard from others too, that our guides and people who are working with us do this for us to make sure. It's almost like providing us either through mediums or through precognitive experiences. It's like a personal and experiential support to say, hey, this validates your research. You're not crazy. This stuff really happened. So thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences. Let's talk. I want to talk a little bit about two historical scientists who have paved the way for us. In particular, I'm interested in you perhaps guiding us in terms of how did, for example, let's start with Sir William Crookes. How did Sir William Crookes, how was he able to relate, for example, physics or his subatomic particles or anything that was sort of scientifically based in relationship to the nature of the universe? How was he able to do that?
Well, he was, of course, an extraordinary man. He was president of the Royal Society, and he started out as a research chemist, and he was a professor, of course, but he also had inherited quite a lot of money, so he did a lot of his research in a private laboratory that he built himself. So that helped a lot because he wasn't dependent on research grants from others, which people are these days. And he did the conventional things. He discovered thallium, a new element. But what got him into psychical research was encountering Daniel Dunglass Hume, who was a very prominent medium of the time, who seemed to have remarkable powers. I mean, he had been seen to levitate, for instance, and he was able to make. He would give messages from post-mortem messages, but also would be able to make things move by thinking at them, and so psychokinesis. And so Crookes started to do experiments with Hume, and he took him into his laboratory and did some very, very careful experiments, which you can see if you're in most, old universities have the journal that he published in, which was the Quarterly Journal of Science, which was a typical Victorian journal with wonderful engravings of the apparatus that he used. And he did some very, very careful experiments where Hume claimed to be able to make objects move. So he would have some object very finely balanced on springs and wires, and then he would ask Hume to think at it, and it would move. An accordion would play without anybody touching it. And these were up to then had been anecdotes, because some local gentry who'd had Hume in to give a seance would say, "Oh, he did this, oh, he did that." But Crookes said, "Right, we're going to do this scientifically," and had a very, very high reputation. So the world of science said, right, if Crookes looks at this, then we'll get the answers. So he did these very careful experiments. The trouble was they came out as positive. And so he published this in the journal, Quarterly Journal of Science. It's a classic. There's a couple of papers involved, and they're classics. But the conclusion was Hume was able to achieve these results, and that's really struck already. Even though Crookes had a very, very high reputation, already this was unwelcome, and people didn't like that at all. But then he compounded that by getting involved with trying to test a medium who was a materialization medium. This was Florence Cook, and she had a guide or a spirit who always appeared for her from building up out of her by materialization, called Katie King. And so again, Florence, she'd become sort of famous or notorious, and Crookes decided he would study this, and very bravely did so, and carried out lots of seances in which he was really able to demonstrate that this Katie King was a completely different entity from Florence Cook. She was a different height, she looked different. He photographed them both together, and this was all done in private seances. I mean, it wasn't any way she could have smuggled in an accomplice. It all happened within private seances run by Crookes, and there was no way around accepting the evidence that he was able to present. And again, this exceeded the sort of boggle threshold of nearly everybody, and they started to think about, well, it must be a hoax, and if it must be that Crookes is having an affair with her, and that this was to cover it up. But in fact, in the records of the seances, in nearly every case, Crookes' wife was present, and she was the one who actually searched the medium to make sure she wasn't hiding any ectoplasm anywhere. And so there was no possibility that it could have been an affair. But any desperate thing to hang on to other than accept that something absolutely extraordinary was being reported. And so that never got accepted. And so we had this very peculiar schizophrenic status that he entered into, where he was continued to be incredibly respected for his discovery of thallium, discovery of his later work on cathode rays, and discovering and inventing the radiometer. He was a very great physicist and president of the Royal Society, so he was incredibly distinguished, but his psychical research was ignored, and people just didn't talk about it, and it wasn't. Even science would say, well, here's thallium discovered by Crookes. Here's cathode rays, which ultimately led to the cathode ray tube, discovered by Crookes, but not here's materialization by mediums discovered by Crookes. That was hidden away.
Let's talk about that point for a second, because I think.
Join us each week as Donna Smith-Moncrieffe explores topics related to spiritual energy and consciousness. Collaborating with other experts, they will share evidence and ideas for you to integrate consciousness-based ideas into your life for a positive transformation.